Hey, it's Dr. John Terry, the Black Belt Leader, and welcome to the Black Belt Leadership Podcast, where each week I'm giving you tips, tools, insights, and resources to help you become a better version of who you are and what you do as you discover, develop, and deploy your own Black Belt leader within. This week, I want to talk about the best, worst excuse you're ever going to make. You know, it's easier to make excuses than it is to commit to change. Now, I want to say that again because that sets the tone for what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes. It's easier to make excuses than it is to commit to change. Now, why is that the case? Why is it easier to make excuses than to commit to change in our lives? Well, by definition, an excuse is an attempt to lessen the blame for a failure or an offense. It's an attempt to defend, to justify, to rationalize, or explain an action, and at the same time, not take personal responsibility for the consequences that occurred because of something we did or failed to do. An excuse is nothing more than pointing the finger at someone or something else rather than pointing the finger back at us and saying we are to blame for what happened. It's a denial of the truth. More than that, it's a perpetuation of a half-truth or an outright lie. Now, one of my mentors, Chris Robinson, has a great quote regarding excuses, and it really helps set the stage for what I want to spend a few minutes talking about in today's episode. And that quote is this: "The best excuse is the worst excuse." Now, you may say, John, why is that the case? Well, let me finish the quote. Chris says this: "The best excuse is the worst excuse because we accept it and we believe it to be true." Now, think about that for a minute. The very best excuse you're ever going to make is the worst excuse you're ever going to make because you accept it and you believe it to be true. Making excuses is easy, but making excuses doesn't allow us to learn from the mistake that we've made. When we make excuses, what are we doing? We're shifting the blame, the shame, and the guilt that we're feeling for failing or falling short in some way. And at the same time, we're looking to shift the conversation away from our own guilt, our own shame, our own responsibility for an outcome that is uncomfortable, and being able to point the finger somewhere else, to say it was out of my control. It was something that he did or she did or something happened that was outside our ability to control it. We're trying to pass the excuse on and blame someone or something else. Now, from a psychological perspective, we don't want to look like a failure. So what do? We blame someone, we blame something, and that lessens the blow to our self-esteem. Our ego remains intact, and the perception of who we are remains unchanged because it wasn't our fault. Now, I love the way Psychology Today talks about excuses. An article, November 19, 2019, there was a quote from that talking about excuses I thought was powerful, and let me share it with you. It says, "Since we are capable of experiencing shame and guilt, we want to lessen the perceived and potential blame from others or any self-blame we attach to an offense or a fault. An excuse shifts causality from a more threatening source that can impact our self-esteem to a less central one." In short, we're playing the blame game. Now, one of my favorite TV sitcoms growing up was Hogan's Heroes. It was a TV show my dad loved, and we would watch it when it would come on television. And if you're not familiar with the show, it was a satire based upon World War II and POWs held in Nazi Germany. These POWs from different Allied forces had been captured, and they had been locked up in the most secure prison in all of Germany, Stalag 13. Now, Stalag 13 in reality was a base of operation for the Allied forces that had been captured that were using that base, that prison camp, as a means to escape and engage in acts of sabotage to sabotage the Nazis' attempt to take over Europe and the rest of the world and to give the Allied forces an opportunity to actually win the war. It was really a spoof, but it was a celebration of the life lived and the memory of individuals that were immortalized in the movie The Great Escape that had been captured and attempted to escape and almost won their freedom. That movie was a great satire and a great thank you to the men who gave their lives in fighting for freedom and the opportunity they saw to try to escape from their captors. Now, if you are a fan of this TV show like I am, one of the most beloved characters in that TV series was Sergeant Schultz, the overweight, food-loving, happy-go-lucky sergeant that was in charge of the barracks. Now, Colonel Hogan was the commander of the Allied forces that were there, and he led the sabotage teams that would go out and enact in acts of espionage against the Nazi forces. But when Colonel Hogan and his fellow POWs would sneak out of the camp, or they were working on a project to go wreak havoc somewhere in Germany or somewhere else that they needed to travel to and to do the things necessary to give the Allied forces an upper hand in World War II, oftentimes Schultz would inadvertently see more than he was supposed to see. Now, Schultz, not wanting to get involved, not wanting to get into trouble, and fearful that he might be shipped off to the Russian front if he was found to be incapable and not actively managing his role in taking care of the prisoners, Schultz would often respond with an iconic quote, "I see nothing, I hear nothing." That was Schultz's quote. Anytime that he would see or hear something he wasn't supposed to, his eyes would close, his hands would go to the ears, and it was, "I see nothing, I hear nothing." That was Sergeant Schultz. And if you've ever watched the show, you're probably smiling as I am as you remember Schultz's iconic quote. Now, for Schultz, it was easier for him to pretend like he didn't see what he saw rather than have to take action that was required to bring about the outcome that was desired by the head of the camp. Now, for us, it's an example for us and a reminder that it's easier to deny what we see that's true, especially if the outcome can put us in a bad light. Schultz didn't want to go to the Russian front, and I get it. Nobody wanted to go there and fight a losing battle. So for him, it was easier to close his eyes and pretend nothing happened, to make an excuse rather than to take action. So just like Sergeant Schultz, what do? We deny what we see is true, and we make an excuse. I see nothing. I hear nothing. I did nothing. It's not my fault. But understand this, an excuse leaves us where we are, as we are, unchanged. Now, from a personal growth perspective, and you know I'm big on personal growth, from a personal growth and development perspective, when we deny our role in failure and we attempt to cast the responsibility elsewhere, what are we doing? We're closing our eyes to the very lesson life is trying to teach us. And when we do that, when we ignore the lesson life is trying to teach us to help us learn and grow, guess what? We've just set ourselves up to go through that same experience or a similar experience over and over again until we take ownership of the outcome, our role in causing that failure to happen, and learn the lesson life is trying to teach us so we can apply it and not make the same mistake over and over again. Making an excuse is choosing to stay stuck and repeating the same mistake over and over and over again. It's like the movie Groundhog Day, where every day is the same, and every day you're repeating the same blunders over and over again. Now, excuses can happen to anyone, and it can also happen to major corporations. You know, George Eastman launched the first successful roll film camera, aptly named the Kodak, in 1888. From there, Eastman went on to build a photo film empire that lasted until the early 2000s. In 1976, Eastman's company, Kodak, controlled and commanded 90% of all film sales and 85% of all camera sales in the United States. 20 years later, 1996, Kodak controlled more than 2/3 of the global market when it came to the share of photographic film sold worldwide. In 1996, the company was worth more than $31 billion, making Kodak the fifth most valuable brand in the world. Now, Kodak expanded beyond photographic film into the video market. They introduced 8mm film, beta, and VHS format videotapes, along with the line of floppy disks for computers. Now, maybe you're not old enough to remember floppy disk. I am. Those big 5 1/4 floppy drives that you would stick in and actually use those to load programs into a computer. We didn't have the ability back then with the internet in its infancy to download large files, so everything came on these 5 1/4 inch floppy drives. Kodak was one of the major suppliers of that. Now, another thing about Kodak I thought was interesting, not only were they involved in 8mm beta and VHS format videotape, they launched an all-weather camera, one of the first waterproof cameras ever to be put out for public distribution and public consumption. That camera could take photographs in depths of up to 8 feet of water. It was the very first commercial effort to bring a camera to retail customers, moms and dads and kids, that they could have a camera, they could get into the pool, dive into the pool or into a small body of water and take pictures up to 8 feet underwater. You know, Kodak also created the drop-in film canister, which allowed unexposed film to be safely removed from a camera and then reloaded, the film exposed, and then later sent off for development. But for all of the advancements and all of the innovative things Kodak was doing, Kodak failed in one area. They failed to embrace the rise of digital technology. They got stuck in the tried and true approach to still and moving pictures that had served them well for decades. But as rivals continued to enter the market, really focused on digital photography and digital motion pictures, Kodak failed to pivot. They never found a profitable way to move beyond photographic film. Sadly, they were delisted from the Dow 30 Industrials in 2004. They continued to lose market share year after year after year until ultimately filing for bankruptcy in 2012. You know, interestingly enough, Kodak invented the world's first digital camera in the 1980s. But the leadership shelved the project when they found out the camera could take pictures without film. And because film was their mainstay, the leadership of Kodak, rather than embracing a new technology that has gone on to become the industry standard, they chose to stay with their current, soon to be obsolete business model of focusing on film. So Kodak chose to make excuses, citing a fear of cannibalizing its own film business to embrace digital. That was one of the main reasons they kept saying, we don't want to embrace digital. It will cannibalize our film business. And rather than embrace the new technology that was coming, they chose to stay where they were, as they were, stuck and unchanged. And as a result of that, the new technologies that came in and transformed not only the still photography business, but the moving photography business has changed dramatically, and Kodak was left to the waste bin of society. Remember, the best excuse is the worst excuse because you accept it and believe it to be true. The best excuse was the worst excuse for Kodak because they accepted it and believed it to be true and failed to embrace a technology that would have allowed them to continue to dominate in the photographic market for decades to come. Now, we also see this excuse making today with the debacle that is the southern border of the United States. Both political parties, Republican and Democrat, are pointing fingers, blaming each other rather than coming together as United States representatives and senators and actually finding a way to solve the problem, while at the same time, millions of migrants continue to illegally surge across an open border seeking their path to the American dream. Now, the long-term impact of this open southern border on the American taxpayer, as well as the infrastructure of the countless cities across the United States that are being impacted and will continue to be impacted by illegal immigration, is not going to be fully realized for years to come. And this cost, I promise you, is going to be staggering and may very well bankrupt this nation. Remember, the best excuse is the worst excuse because we accept it and we believe it to be true. But it begs the question, why do we make excuses? Well, I think it's pretty simple. And if you've listened to my podcast for any period of time, you've heard me talk about the fact that we are all creatures of habit. You and I, we are comfortable with the way things are, and we don't want to change. In fact, our brain loves the familiar. And anytime we want to engage in change to improve our lives, our brain mistakenly perceives that as an area of danger and seeks to bring us back to the status quo. So it's easier to make an excuse. It's easier to remain where we are rather than to take responsibility and be forced to change how we think, how we behave, and how you and I choose to act. Making an excuse is a whole lot easier than holding ourselves accountable or allowing other people to hold us to account for our actions or lack thereof. And interestingly enough, we care more about how we are perceived in the moment than how we're going to be perceived long term in the future. Let me say that again. You and I are more concerned about how we are perceived right now in the moment and not seen as a failure rather than learning how we're going to be perceived in the future by giving ourselves the opportunity to learn, to grow, improve, and become a better version of ourselves. We don't want to look like a failure, so we make excuses rather than admit that we messed up, learn from our mistake, and use that to learn, to grow, and to improve. Making excuses, as I said at the beginning, is easier than committing to change. So let me wrap up today's teaching with three things you can do to stop making excuses and start committing to change things in your life for the better. First, you've got to acknowledge and you've got to accept responsibility. You've got to own your mistakes and you've got to own your failures. It's easy to celebrate and accept your role in the wins, but it's also too important to accept your role in failure and the lesson it's trying to teach you. When you deny your role in failure, you are lying to yourself and you're also lying to those you should be accountable to. And that in itself is a character flaw that needs to be corrected. Unless and until you admit your mistakes and admit your role in making those mistakes, you're never going to learn, you're never going to grow, you're never going to improve in that area. You're going to remain stuck where you are, as you are, unchanged, repeating the same mistakes over and over again. Now, the second thing you've got to do is you've got to set some SMART goals for yourself. Now, I've talked about SMART goals on and off for years, and SMART goals are objectives or outcomes, things you want to achieve that are specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. That's the acrostic SMART: specific, measurable, attainable, or you could use the word achievable, realistic, and time-bound or time-sensitive. You want to make sure once you've set a SMART goal that you break a longer SMART goal down into smaller, manageable steps. I talk often about chunking it down. You know, my mom asked me when I was a kid, how do you eat the elephant? And it was one bite at a time. Same with our goals. If we've got a big, hairy, audacious goal we want to achieve, we've got to chunk it down into smaller bites that we can digest and chew and chew and chew until we eat that elephant and accomplish our goal or our objective. When we break things down into smaller chunks, into manageable steps in the process, we can experience more meaningful progress along the way, and we can celebrate the little wins. And those little wins, as we celebrate them, compound over time until the longer term goal is reached. Now, let me give you an example of what I mean by setting a SMART goal and then chunking it down into smaller steps that make it easier to reach the big goal one step at a time. I had a good friend of mine that several years ago weighed over 300 pounds. He set a goal to lose 100 pounds in 12 months. Now, 100 pounds, that's a lot of weight. But he broke his smart long-term goal down into chunks that he could manage. So what did he do? He took 100 pounds and he divided it by 50 weeks. His goal, again, 100 pounds in 12 months. He wanted to give himself 2 weeks of margin in there. So he took 100, divided it by 50. Simple math, 2 pounds a week. He broke it down even further. He said, John, I just had to lose a little more than a quarter pound a day. I could sweat that off. I could skip just one little snack and I could achieve losing a quarter pound a day. But day after day, Wayne focused on losing a quarter pound. He focused on 2 pounds a week. Now, my friend met his SMART goal, that long-term goal of 100 pounds, in just 48 weeks. And he's maintained that weight loss for over 10 years. I applaud him every time I see him, but he finally had to come to fact and meet himself in the mirror, have a man in the mirror moment with himself and say, it's my fault I'm overweight. I've got to quit eating as much as I'm eating. I've got to eat better foods than what I'm eating. And I've got to get off my butt and start exercising and burn more calories than I'm taking in. It's a very simple process, but how many of us make an excuse rather than commit to the change? Now, the third success tip, the third thing you've got to do to stop making excuses and start committing to change is to surround yourself with good accountability partners. You need a support system, and that system needs to be comprised of people who are going to encourage you, inspire you, challenge you, kick you in the butt when it's needed, chastise you when you fall off the wagon and you've got to get up off your knees and get going again, but they also cheer you when you succeed. Now, this could be a family member, it could be a friend, it could be a colleague, or it could be a group of people who will not let you make excuses and will hold you accountable to whatever it is that you have committed to do. Remember, the best excuse is the worst excuse because you accept it and you believe it to be true. So the best way to get rid of the best worst excuse is to own your failure. Now, it's easy to remember this. Nobody's perfect, and that includes you. We're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to mess up. We're all going to fall short, and at some point in time, we're all going to fail. Every successful person has failed, but successful people fail their way to success. So let me challenge you. Get over yourself. Forget your ego. When you mess up, and you're going to, admit you blew it, learn from it, apply what you've learned, and don't go back and do it again. Remember this, unsuccessful people commit to change. Unsuccessful people refuse to commit to change. I want to get that right. Unsuccessful people make excuses. They are unwilling to commit to change. But successful people do daily what unsuccessful people do sometimes or not at all. And while unsuccessful people refuse to commit to change, successful people don't make excuses. They commit to change. So here's my question. If you can be an unsuccessful person who refuses to commit to change and make excuses, or you could be a successful person who doesn't make excuses but commits to change, which of those two do you want to be? You're going to be one or the other, and you get to choose. So my challenge to you is to choose wisely. Remember, the best excuse is the worst excuse because you accept it and you believe it to be true. But successful people do daily what unsuccessful people do sometimes or not at all. Successful people don't make excuses. They commit to change. If you want to be successful, stop making excuses and start committing to change. Hey, I'm Dr. John Terry, the Black Belt Leader. I want to say thank you for joining me for this Black Belt Leadership Podcast. Have a great day.